I'd like to say that it's really exciting to see this research moving ahead in critical new spaces, right? So there's lots of research out there on the arts, and in part, I'm going to do our research a little bit of injustice because lots of what I'm going to talk about today is stuff we already know. But what we don't know, and what's important about the report that we've published in part as a CRIMT output, is a systemic overview, right, of the degree to which gender inequality is truly a defining feature of all the arts and cultural industries. But the work that you're doing, Philippe, and the work that you're doing, Laurence and Christian, is really starting to drill down at a really important level on some of the really sticky on the dance floor, if you don't mind, issues that underpin that represent the big picture that I'm going to present to everybody today. So, this is the report that has just been published as of last week via the Ontario Arts Council. It was an absolute pleasure to package this through the OAC and, in fact, with my CRIMT colleagues, Laurence Dubuc, Philippe Barret, and some Australian colleagues as well, Kate McNeil at the University of Melbourne, Jordan Beth Vincent, and Caitlin Beth Vincent, who are colleagues of mine at Deakin. We were approached by the Ontario Arts Council just about a year ago because there was no overarching study of gender, the status of women, in the arts and cultural sector broadly. Lots and lots and lots of research on a sector-by-sector basis, except for dance, as we discovered. And we'll get to that later. But there's consequences for that, right? So while sectorally focused studies tell us lots about sectoral dynamics and are really important launching points to begin sectorally focused discussions and action plans, what they don't do is allow both the organizations that represent the workers and the workers themselves to understand the degree to which their experience is in fact not an isolated one. It also masks sector-by-sector studies, masks, as I've said, the degree to which this is actually a defining feature of work in the arts and cultural industries more broadly. Well, and again, this is not new, right? Gender inequality is a defining feature of the world of work, right? But why does this matter? Why do we care about the arts and cultural sector? Specifically, what's a defining feature of it? Okay, well, look, let me ask you a really basic question. Like, how many people in the last 24 hours have turned on their radio? Hands up. Have looked at a painting, read a book, watched TV, right? Congratulations, you're all consumers and audiences of the arts and cultural industries, right? And what do? The arts and cultural industries tell stories. And we begin to use stories as a really important socializing device from before our children are born. We read stories to them in utero. The second that they're born, we give them creative tools to help them make sense of their world. We read them stories at nighttime. We put them in front of screens before they can walk. We give them paints, right, to say, okay, express yourself. So this means that the stories that we tell are major, major socializing institutions about how we learn about ourselves and the world around us. So the question then becomes, who is telling whose stories and under what conditions? So we must understand the question of storytelling and the arts as having both an employment equity focus, right? Of course, there's a question around, pay equity, et cetera, which was in large part the focus of our work today, but also the broader social significance of this for the audiences and consumers who have access to these stories. I'm doing two screens. Okay, so this was a big report. It was a review of the existing research across 6 sectors. So let me just go back. Theater, dance, visual arts, literature, publishing, screen, and music. What do we know? What do we know about the status of women in the arts? The original focus was Ontario. The very quick answer was not very much at a provincial level, right? Not enough to actually generate a robust report. So we quickly scaled up to Canada more generally. And I have to say that having Laurence and Philippe on the team was absolutely instrumental so that the Anglophone could access, in fact, the French, the Quebec-based literature, and then so we can actually say, this does represent, right? This does represent Canada. So that was yay CRIMT. Okay. So we had to break it down very quickly into thematic analysis, and I'm going to gallop through the key findings. The report is live. You can find it on the CRIMT website, can't you? Thank you, Nicola. And it's rich in empirical detail. All we looked at was quantitative data, all right? And that was an adventure in its own right. How do we package this up and do it thematically? So we looked at workforce and employment patterns in the first instance. What do we know? Lots of the research comes from the National Household Survey, okay? Processed, analyzed by Hill Strategies, and the major arts funders all agree on 9 key artistic occupations that generally give us a snapshot of what we need to know about the arts and cultural industries more generally. So there they are: actors and comedian, artists and craftspersons, authors and writers, conductors, composers and arrangers, dancers, musicians, singers, other performers, producers, directors, choreographers, and visual artists. Okay. So we sorted the gender distribution within these occupations into 3 categories: gender equal, gender imbalanced, and gender balanced, which is no more than 40% and no less than 60% of the general population. And that's based on the work of the Council of Europe and the European Institute for Gender Equality. They consider that gender distribution a threshold for political participation. And then gender imbalanced is more than 60% of either gender, either way. So what do we know? Okay, so in theory, wow, we're doing all right. Musicians and singers, 50-50. Things are looking good. Stay tuned. What else do we know? We know that 4 of the occupational groups are gender balanced, okay? 3 of those 4 occupational groups have a higher percentage of women than men. This is an interesting story. Follow the thread, okay? So authors are 54% female, visual artists, and other performers. We don't really know what's in the other performers category, but we're going to set that aside for now. Only the actors and comedians has fewer women, 46% than men. I don't know if anyone's been following the news, but there's been lots of discussion about sexual harassment in the stand-up comedian world. Okay. Gender imbalance categories. Now we're starting to find some really interesting patterns here, okay? Because these positions are now starting to signal something about leadership roles. So conductors, composers, and arrangers, right? 65% male. Producers, directors, and choreographers, which, by the way, includes both stage and screen, okay? 67% male. Artisans and craftspersons, however, are 61% female. And dancers is by far the most gender imbalanced category. Nationally, the stats are a little bit higher than what they are in Quebec at 80% female. Okay, what do we know? Wow, nothing new here. There's a gender division of labor in the arts and cultural industries. Women are overrepresented in categories that are traditionally understood to be women's work, like hair, makeup, wardrobe, administration. Men are overrepresented in technical roles. So the examples that I am offering you today offer a smattering of data from across the 6 industries the 6 sectors that we looked at. Okay, so one of the striking things about the Ontario music sector is that nearly 70% of women who work in the sector are concentrated in 4 roles, right? In 4 areas of work. Johanna, this will come as no surprise to you that women are 25%, I found this really interesting, of the interactive digital media workforce in Ontario. And those women are highly concentrated in very few firms. So 20% of the nearly 900, these are little teeny tiny companies by large measure, employ only men. 10% of the companies report employing over 75% women. So if only 25% of the workforce, thank you, Sheila, is female, they're working in very few firms. Okay, 5 minutes left. Now, hang on, though, right? Some sectors are female-dominated. Some roles are female-dominated. Publishing, editorial and sales, and marketing publicity in literature and publishing, female-dominated, okay? The workforce in Ontario not-for-profit art galleries and museums, female-dominated. So this is not a straightforward story. There's a gender pay gap, it's bad, okay? What does this tell us? A, that overall the incomes in the sector are dismally low. Secondly, that there's a gender pay gap across all sectors. This is based on the National Household Survey, this particular graph. We went and we double-checked the findings to confirm them with other available reports. All of them were confirmed except for dancers. That particular set of data shows that female dancers earn 102% of their male counterparts. There's lots of reasons to suggest that that is in fact not a representative statistic because it's that's the only data set we were able to find that says that. And we can drill down on why later, but there's lots of evidence to suggest that that in fact is not the case. Okay. Education and training. How do we explain this gender pay gap? Is it that women are not as well trained or skilled? No, the answer is no. Okay, that's all we need to know. There's no evidence to suggest that that's a driving factor. Now, what do we know about organizational leadership? We broke this down, leadership, into two categories. One, organizational leadership, which is like a managerial and strategic role in a particular company, right? Which is quite different from artistic leadership. So again, we have really a bifurcated landscape here. It's a mixed story. Music industry, women hold only 23% of named executive positions, right? And a survey of 30 music companies in Ontario, 48% of the companies in Ontario have 0 women in their executive tier, 0. Very little research on classical music and gender and opera, very little research. What we do know comes from an American study that said in 2008, women represented only 29% of general directors in professional Canadian opera companies. However, let's go back over to visual arts, literature, and publishing. Women are 70% of the directors in the 80 Canadian art galleries and museums that receive funding from the Canada Council. We cannot say there's a leadership problem there based on gender inequality unless we want to say women are overrepresented. Which, by the way, I got some really vicious social media feedback about some of the phrasing in the report. Okay, so this is the core story. It's mixed. However, when we get to artistic leadership, this is the people who shape the stories that we consume. To be fair, lots of organizational leadership also has a determinant role in what gets pulled up, marketed, developed, financed, etc. However, the artistic leadership roles, this was absolutely unequivocal. So this pretty red is men. Artistic directors in theater companies, stage directors, music directors in theater companies, screen composers. There was a study just released on screen composers. It is absolutely brutal. The gender pay gap for female screen composers is getting measurably worse over the last 10 years. So fewer and fewer female screen composers are working. Thank you, Sheila. Okay. So if curators are an artistic leadership role, right? Women, again, hold 70% of curator positions in the Canadian art galleries, and curators are important because they determine who gets shows, right? So if we know that women are dominant in the visual arts sector, both in terms of organizational leadership and in curatorship roles, then we're in big trouble. Because this is a graph that represents solo shows of living female artists. This is really important that they're living because they have the ability this will influence their careers as they're moving through them in major Canadian art institutions, one in each province plus the National Gallery. The story here is that overall, right, men have disproportionate access to solo shows, which is really instructive for their professional profile, right? Although there is considerable variation. Thank you, Sheila. Okay, so we see that there are, Nova Scotia has a much higher representation of women. What is really important is notable for its absence is the representation of non-white artists overall. And there's almost no data on this. Okay, I've got my last slide. Here we go. Career and industry recognition. Men have disproportionate access to stages all around. Their works are seen more often in more venues. This is true across screen. This is true across the music industry, music festivals, theater productions. We have very little information, hard data on dance and choreography, but anecdotally, we found lots of evidence to suggest that's true. Although there are important signals of change, right? So that is the percentage of films directed by women at Hot Docs, one of the premier documentary festivals in the world, and this is because of industry activism. So for the first time this year, we hit 50% women. However, we still have to keep the core question at our fore as we begin to drill down on some of the dynamics and wrestle with the really hard questions like sexual harassment and toxic workplace cultures, which is, if stories are our social currency, how equitably is that wealth distributed? Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Amanda.